All right, folks, I think we're going to get started. There'll be others joining us, I'm sure. But one of the things we'd like to do in the speaker series is always bring something that has social responsibility. And even though that you may not think it directly involves supply chain, it does, because believe me, when you're trying to move product anywhere in the world right now, it's a real challenge. And it's always great to have someone come in and speak about a charitable group and helping some of the economic development areas around the world. And we're so pleased to have Joel Cox from the Seed Effect. He's the Director of Operations in the United States, and he'll certainly go through everything, but I think you'll find it intriguing, and please feel free to ask questions. Joel, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, so my name's Joel Cox. Thank you guys for joining with me today. It's a pleasure and honor to get to talk to you guys. I didn't personally go to TCU, but I've got lots of roots that did. My parents both went to TCU and played in the band at TCU, and my wife went to TCU. So I love all things TCU. So it's a pleasure to get to be with you guys today and share a little bit about Seed Effect. So thanks for joining me. So Seed Effect is it's a Christian organization. It's a Christ-centered organization. It's an economic development organization. And our mission is to plant the seeds that overcome poverty in the really hard places. And so for us, for Seed Effect, that has meant a particular focus on refugee crises, people in extreme and other people in extreme poverty contexts. So we specifically have a history of working in South Sudan in Africa, and most recently in northern Uganda, the reason for which I'll tell you in a second. So I work for Seed Effect in the US. There's 4 of us on staff here in the US, and then we have 60 full-time South Sudanese and Ugandans working in country doing the actual work of Seed Effect. And so my role with them is as Director of Operations for Seed Effect is to work alongside that team of 60 full-time South Sudanese and Ugandans to make sure they have what they need to do any training that's necessary to help them think through operational planning, budgets, all of those things. I'm operations guy. The other 3 people here in the US are focused mostly on fundraising. But I get to work with our in-country team and normally go there about 4 times a year. I haven't been in a while, but normally go there about 4 times a year. So you may or may not know, you probably don't, because I wouldn't if I didn't work for Seed Effect. The world is currently facing a global refugee crisis. There are over 80 million displaced people worldwide. That's the largest number in history. And what most people don't know is that after fleeing, 99% of refugees will remain in a country adjacent to their own. And 86% of the time, that adjacent country is impoverished itself. So you have refugees leaving everything behind, kind of starting fresh where they're going, but also the country they're going into has a lot of people living in extreme poverty itself. A key aspect of this is that the average time that refugees spend in exile is over 10 years. So that's something I did not know before working for Seed Effect. We found that the prevailing thought is that if people have to flee their homes as refugees, that it's most often a short-term situation. So it's often treated as a short-term situation when the reality is that it's most often a decade or longer situation. It's not a short-term problem. And so one example of this, and the one that we're addressing, is the country of South Sudan. So South Sudan has experienced a long history of tribal conflict and more formal wars as time has gone on. They've had 2 back-to-back civil wars. They had a short time of independence and peace, and now have a renewed conflict about 4 or 5 years ago that has led to over 1 million South Sudanese fleeing into northern Uganda and getting settled in refugee settlements in northern Uganda as refugees. And so for many of them, this is actually their third time in their life they've had to flee their country and start their lives over again in a refugee settlement. And so I wanted to share with you one story, if I could. So this is a member of ours, one of the women we work with. Her name's Makalata, and this is the beginning of her story. She said, "I left South Sudan because I was attacked by soldiers. They wanted to shoot me. They tried to release the bullet, but it wouldn't come out. I know it was the power of God that saved me. I left South Sudan the following morning, but the roads were closed. I knelt in prayer and God opened a way for me, and I came through the bush. I had lost all my money and all of my property. I was left with nothing. When I arrived in Uganda, it was very difficult." So when a South Sudanese refugee like Makalata arrives in the refugee settlement, so she literally ran in the night, ran to Uganda. She shows up in the refugee settlement, and what happens is Uganda actually is very friendly to refugees. There's kind of a history of that. Many Ugandans have had to flee Uganda to be refugees, and so there's kind of a reciprocal, they kind of know what it's like, and so they actually are pretty friendly to refugees. So they designate land for these refugees, or they have designated land for refugee settlements. And so each refugee family gets a 30 by 30 meter plot of land. They get a tarp for their shelter, and they get meager monthly food rations. So think like a sack of rice, right, to feed your family. It's definitely not enough for 3 meals a day. There's no variety to it. It's just kind of enough to get you started and keep you hanging on, but certainly not enough to feed your whole family, and certainly not enough for every day. And then they're expected to start their lives over, really without any other tools that would be needed to start your life over like that. And so I think it's worth actually kind of considering, and I know we won't kind of toss ideas back and forth here, but this is a context that thankfully we don't have to think a whole lot about, haven't in our lives. And so I think it's worth, I think, attempting to put yourself in that headspace of what it would be like to spend 10 years in exile in an impoverished country. What if a bomb went off? What if a war broke out? What if a natural disaster erupted and you literally in the night had to run? What would you lose? What would you be leaving behind? Your home, wherever you're living, you certainly would be leaving that. Your car, your cell phone, if you have to switch countries like these people have had to do, your cell phone's probably not going to work. Your source of food, whatever your source of food may be, your money, whatever money you have, you've probably left behind. You're not going to have a bank account in wherever it is you end up. You're not going to have a credit card that works in wherever you end up. But even beyond those physical needs, what would you lose? What about your roommates? If you just had to start running, would you keep track of them? What about your family, wherever they are? If they were running too, how would you get back in touch with them? If you go to a church or church family or whatever kind of community focused thing, your fraternity or sorority, like whatever kind of your community is, those relationships, that those people that you rely on, you would lose them. What about even like psychological things like hope? You're in college, you have this plan, maybe you have, if you're a lucky one, maybe you have a plan for what's coming next after school, or you're building towards something with some idea that there's this opportunity coming, that you're headed somewhere. If something like that happened, that all kind of evaporates instantly. Just the hope of what's coming next, your identity, how you think of yourself. You think of yourself as a college student, a TCU college student in these organizations, at this major, heading toward this career path from this place. Like whatever things you use to describe yourself, how much of that would even be lost if you just had to uproot overnight and run? And then what would you need? You would need those things that you lost, figuring out a food source, figuring out a water source, figuring out, you guys don't have kids yet probably, but if you had kids, how do you get them in school? What about their future? What if you got sick? How would you address healthcare? How would you rebuild community? If you left everything behind, you've got to rely on other people. Who are you relying on? Who are you trusting? You're most likely traumatized. Whatever event has happened, whatever things you've experienced you've never seen before, you just had to run. What's going on in your head that is even, you're trying to just even figure out and grasp what life has become all of a sudden. So I know that's difficult to do, but I just think it's worth like actually sitting back and thinking there's 80 million people living that reality right now, living in that space. And so I think it's worth thinking through what that would be like for you and what you would want, what you would need if you found yourself in that situation. So at Seed Effect, we talk a lot about the difference between refuge and restoration. So refuge is a condition of being safe or sheltered from pursuit, danger, or trouble, whereas restoration is the action of returning something to a former owner, place, or condition. And we believe that in the context we're working in, that refuge is not the end goal, but restoration is. The problem, though, as we see it, is that most solutions to refugee crises, and that's where we decided to focus, really, you could probably insert extreme poverty in general in that space, but refugee crises, people living in extreme poverty in general, most solutions to the problem of extreme poverty and refugee crises, there's a few of them. One is that most solutions are short-term in nature. So they're aid handout based, which, don't get me wrong, there is certainly an emergency, especially in a refugee crisis, right? There's absolutely an immediate emergency need. Those people need food, water, shelter. They need it today, and they need it for a while. They've got to, you would need help immediately. If you found yourself in that position, you would need access to those things immediately. You need that aid. But aid in and of itself is by nature short-term. It can't last forever. There will be another refugee crisis somewhere else where those funds will funnel over there, or people will just, it will lose kind of the headline, right? And so it just can't last forever. And so those solutions are just short-term and that's the headspace that most people think about refugee crises, is that it's a short-term problem, but on average they last over a decade. And so you're not talking about getting someone over a short hump before they can get back home. You're talking about helping someone rebuild their life. The second is that they tend to create dependency. In other words, they're unsustainable. So if someone is bringing that truckload of food in that emergency situation that you need, if they're not at the same time trying to train you how to create an ongoing food source, then you are going by nature to be dependent on them keep showing up with trucks. But if the trucks stop showing up, then that's not sustainable. It's not sustainable for those trucks to keep showing up, for all of those things to keep happening. They don't leverage the abilities of the people. If you guys all had to run, you guys have abilities. South Sudanese have abilities. They know how to do things. They work really hard. Most short-term solutions don't leverage the capabilities of the people that they're serving. They're not thinking through, what are these people bringing to the table that we can leverage that will end up in a better outcome than if we just try to address it in ourselves on our own. And in that way, we talk about the word dignity a lot. We talk about the inherent dignity of people, that people, just who they are as people, have an inherent dignity. And so leveraging people's abilities, seeing what they're bringing to the table, is a way of dignifying them and respecting the inherent dignity that they have, versus just kind of an assumption that they can't utilize resources, or they can't do anything in this situation. The most solutions to these problems also tend to focus only on material needs. So there's a lot of research behind this that shows that when you ask a Western-minded person, you ask people in America, what is poverty? It's a pretty basic question. When you think what is poverty, most Americans, most Western people in general will focus almost exclusively on material things. They say, oh, poverty is not having enough food, or not having water, not having shelter, not having access to healthcare. That's poverty. But poverty goes way beyond that, actually. When you ask people who are actually living in extreme poverty, they will use much more psychological terms. I talked about hope earlier, and they'll talk much more about losing their sense of self, losing who they are, losing their hope for the future. They'll talk in much more psychological and mental ways than just they'll also mention the material, but it's not simply that. I want to read you a quote from a guy named James Lamuda. So James Lamuda used to be on staff with us at Seed Effect. He was our country director in Uganda. He's Ugandan. He grew up in extreme poverty in Uganda. His father died when he was very young. He and his brothers were having to take care of the household. So I asked him one time this question. I asked him, as we were kind of philosophizing about Seed Effect and about what we were doing, and wanting to make sure we were doing it the right way, I asked him, when you were living in that situation as a kid, what if someone had just shown up with $1,000, with $5,000 and given it to you? What if they had shown up and said, hey, here's a bunch of food? What if they had just shown up and said, hey, I will pay for your school fees? What if they had shown up and say, hey, you have these medical needs, I'm going to give them to you? Is that what we should be doing? Is that the solution? Would that have helped? And he said this. He said, yes, it would help, but just for a short moment. It wouldn't eradicate the deep problem. When you give me something, give me school fees, give me food to eat, you're just postponing my suffering for a short while. But when you stop giving me the money or giving me the school fees, that means I will go back to my previous situation. And also, poverty, on top of the physical lack, it has an emotional aspect, a social aspect, and a spiritual aspect. We were hurting. We had an emotional torture, and that is why we resorted to that kind of life. We also lacked a relationship with God, and because of this lack, even if you had given us money during that time, I don't think we were going to use that money responsibly. We were not going to use that opportunity responsibly. Some more context behind that. He and his brothers actually became alcoholics really young. He became an alcoholic at the age of 12, James did. His brothers got into it before he did, and kind of got him wrapped up in that. And they were so traumatized by the death of their father and by the weight of caring for the family then falling to them, that they got into alcoholism. And so his point was, even if you had shown up, me as a needy person had shown up and provided me all of these things, I was not in a headspace. I was not in a place relationally or health-wise to handle that, to make use of that opportunity. So yes, of course, it would have helped a little bit right at first, but in the long term, it just wouldn't have been the solution that I needed. So what are we doing? What is Seed Effect trying to do? So I'm going to attempt to play a video for you guys just to show briefly, and then I'll go into it in way more detail. But I'm going to attempt to show this. So I hope this works out. Just gives a little bit of a picture of what we do.
They've never known a time of lasting peace. Generation after generation of South Sudanese have been forced to flee their country, then return home, only to be exiled again. These are the hard places. It's from this conflict, this instability, that Seed Effect was born. As the world faces an unprecedented global refugee crisis, we know that present sufferings are not a permanent reality. What started with just 19 women in South Sudan is now hope and opportunity for tens of thousands. We have seen over and over again that Jesus brings restoration and true transformation. When given the right tools, refugees and those trapped in material poverty can grow and provide for their families with dignity. Seed Effect members are starting businesses, sending their children to school, building a community, coming to know Jesus, and loving their neighbor. Bringing Seed Effect to the hard places has not only led to economic empowerment, but has renewed relationships, promoted dignity, and brought hope for the future. It's working, and those we haven't yet reached are asking Seed Effect to grow. But it starts with you investing in them. God is using you to empower our members to look past what is, to catch a vision of what could be. Hope is emerging from hopelessness. Dreams are being ignited, futures redefined. We have the opportunity to empower more people than ever before. Let's grow together.
Sorry, hold on. Okay, so hopefully it gives you a little bit of a picture just of the environment. And so what is it we're attempting to do? So Seed Effect is committed to bringing, I'm going to read these next couple slides just because they're kind of our formal stuff, but Seed Effect is committed to bringing economic empowerment and the hope of Jesus Christ to the hard places. Our vision is for the world's most insecure and underserved communities to be stabilized through economic empowerment and the hope of Jesus. We desire to shift the response to refugee crises by bringing long-term solutions through Christ-centered, self-sustaining, and empowering tools executed by refugees themselves. So we have some core beliefs that form how we attempt to do that. So we believe that people living in poverty are capable. We've talked a little bit about that with the right tools and the opportunity to work, that they can and they will provide for their families with dignity. We believe that restored relationships bring transformation. So we don't believe that the problem is just a money problem, just a material needs problem, but that there's relational components to this, that there needs to be restoration of even kind of our relationship with ourselves and kind of our mental well-being, as well as our relationships with each other. We believe wholeheartedly that the hard places are worth investing in, that these more difficult circumstances, that they are worth it. They're worth the time, they're worth the effort, they're worth the resources to invest in. And we believe that how we help truly matters, that if we want to see movement in poverty, there's lots of ways to do that, but how we do it really matters, and that we believe sustainable solutions with effective tools are the best approach to promote life-giving opportunities and empowerment to people living in material poverty. Okay, so a little bit more into the nuts and bolts of how it works. So essentially what we do is we're an economic development organization. So we form what we call savings and loan groups. We're not the only ones doing this, but we are one of the only ones who has tried it with refugees. So first and foremost, savings and loan groups, they're communal, they're relational. These are groups of 15 to 25 people who we work with as a group, not as individuals. And we will teach them how to work together and utilize the resources they have as a group to improve their circumstances. We help them form and build on community that they can rely on and trust. So first and foremost, it's a communal approach, it's a relational approach, trying to help them utilize the relational capital that they have and develop more relational capital. Second, it's economic empowerment through access and training. So there's a book called Portfolios for the Poor. This comes up in other places, but there's just research that shows that for people in extreme poverty, there's three kind of main elements that really help people start to lift out of that extreme vulnerable situation. One is a safe place to save money. Second is access to small amounts of capital. And third is access to some sort of insurance emergency fund tool. So you may have seen in that video groups with a green box that says Seed Effect on it. So we provide the groups with a green metal lock box. It's got 3 padlocks on it. Inside that box is a manual for how the group works. It's got a calculator. It's got a logbook. It's got pens. It's got just the basic things they need to kind of run the savings and loan component of their group, which I'll get into in a second. So there's trainings that go alongside kind of the more detailed group meeting that I'll get to. We do an entrepreneurial training for our groups. So we do a pretty basic 6-week entrepreneurial course that trains them how to either start or build an existing business, as well as an extra kind of add-on agricultural training. That's for food security purposes and for business purposes. Most people's business, at least the first business they start, will be agriculturally based. They'll start some sort of garden that is to both feed their family and sell the extra in the market to start generating some sort of income. The group, how it works, kind of the nuts and bolts of it is the most important thing that the group is getting is a trainer. So they'll receive a Seed Effect staff member that's going to walk with them at least for a year and train them how to run the savings and loan group. The group of 15 to 25 people, they meet once a week and they bring savings to each and every one of those meetings. And they decide as a group how much they're going to save each week. Everyone brings their savings and they put it in that metal lockbox. Once a month, they take that common savings pool and they turn it around and they loan it to group members who request a loan. So if they have an idea for a business, if it's school fees time, if they have a healthcare expense, whatever it is, they can take a loan out from the group and the group can say yes or no. And then they'll repay that loan back to the group maximum of 3 months later, and they'll repay it with interest back into the group at an interest rate that the group themselves decide. So they're mobilizing their own. We're not putting any money in the box. The group is saving very, very small amounts of money over time. It's building up into a common savings pool that then I, as a group member, have access to as a source of capital to go do something productive with, and then I will repay that loan. Also, once a week, I, as a member, would contribute to an insurance fund. We call it an emergency fund. But the group also lays out at the very beginning what will qualify for an emergency fund payout. So a death in the family that you have to pay for a funeral, or an emergency medical need, not kind of a routine thing, but an emergency medical need, they can decide what will pay out for that, but they're paying into essentially an insurance fund that they can receive a payout from if there's an emergency need that they wouldn't have otherwise expected. So they'll go through that process for a year, saving every week and once a month, doing a loan distribution or a loan repayment. At the end of the year, they take all of the money that they've accumulated, all of the savings and all of the loan repayments and loan interest, and they put it back in the pot, and then they divide it back out to the group members. It's called a share out, and they calculate how much each group member gets based on how much they've saved. So if I saved $100 in the year, I would get my $100 back plus my proportional share of all the interest payments that have come in from those loan repayments. So that's kind of that. We can, if there's questions about that, we can do that at the end, but that's kind of the basic run through of how the money flows, how they're kind of mobilizing the resources, and how that works. The third aspect of these groups is that we really aim for them to be restorative. Again, that refuge versus restoration idea. We really desire for, we implement a Bible study that's and prayer, and the idea is that Bible study addresses these kind of relational conflicts. Again, it's a group saving money together, loaning together. There needs to be trust there, accountability there, forgiveness at times, it talks about money a lot, and wisdom and discernment around money. So we're trying to address more than just the physical need, but also kind of the relational components of that. And finally, it's sustainable. So once we train these groups, they're not reliant on us necessarily to be there anymore. Once they've learned the mechanics of how these groups work, they can run these groups forever. It kind of works in these year-long cycles where they save and do loans for a year. Then they take all that money together and they share it out as kind of a big distribution, but then they can start right back over. Now that they know how this works, they can continue that on forever. It's not dependent on us as an organization. And so in that way, it's sustainable. They can keep going for as long as they like. So the question though is does that work? Right? So the idea is, you want to see meals per day improve. You want to see people's shelters improve. You want to see people's healthcare improve. So you could just go provide those things and see those metrics improve. Or our theory is if you give people access to these tools, they will mobilize their resources, and they will funnel the resources into their areas of greatest need, and we'll still see that impact to those poverty metrics over time. Even though we didn't hand out one meal or pay for anyone's school fees directly, we're training them, equipping them, and empowering them to do that in a productive way themselves. But maybe it doesn't work. Maybe that's a bad idea. And so we set out to measure it. And so we do tons of surveys. We do 4 financial snapshots a year of every group. We survey individual group members on these different poverty metrics to see if we can track improvement over time or not, right? So this is a little bit of what we're seeing. We have 47,000 members in these groups. We've been doing this for about 4 years in Uganda with refugees. So that's telling right off the bat, right? People wouldn't join if they didn't think it would help. So have we come up with something that that these people living in this refugee context are actually going to value? And so they are joining the group, and that number is 47,000. Not because that's all that's demanding it, that's all we can serve at this time. And we're growing constantly, but we just have to roll it out over time as kind of operations and funding dictates. But they're coming, they're demanding it. Those 47,000 members over the last 4 years have saved over $5 million of their own money in these groups. They've generated $3.5 million of loans that have gone out to group members and been repaid back into the groups. And then the sustainability factor. Will the groups keep going? It's a great idea that you equip them and that they can continue forever, but will they? Will they find enough value? And so we track that. How many groups keep going? And 94% of our groups continue after that first year into their second year. Of those groups that go into a second year, 96% of those groups continue on into a third, and 98% of those groups continue on into a fourth. Again, we want to be relationally focused. 99% of our members report improvement in their relationships. And then if I can figure it out, I actually want to, I'm hopeful that you guys will be interested in kind of like a deeper dive into the actual data. So again, we're surveying tons of members, and we actually use Salesforce. So we have Ugandans on the ground taking in these surveys and inputting them into Salesforce so that I can get the results back from here and kind of analyze them. And so I'll go through this quickly, but another big question is, okay, they're saving money, but will they then use that money productively, right? James's thing, right? Even if you had given me money or gotten me access to ways to generate money, I wouldn't have used it productively because of my relational brokenness and the headspace I was in. We're trying to address both those things at once. And so will they use it productively? Again, the idea that we could improve meals by just giving meals, but we think that if we give them access to the tools themselves, they are capable to use it productively and generate improvement in these metrics on their own. So generally with these, we want to see the red responses decrease and the green and yellow responses grow. We generate frequency of meat because that's a poverty metric. Again, it's rice, protein is just for health. And are they kind of improving their quality of meals? So we see the less than 1 month responses decrease pretty well over time, and we see the once in a week responses grow over time. Meals per day, we see the number of people who say at the beginning, before they ever started in a group, we survey them and ask them these questions. So how many people said 1 per day? And that number has almost completely dropped off by year 3. And the number of people who said they're only eating 3 meals or 1 meal a day. How they pay a doctor. This is a really important one. So people who are in extreme poverty, what tends to happen is they will start to lift up a little bit out of vulnerability. They'll get a little bit of money and they'll buy a chicken, right, in order to sell eggs in the market. So they have this asset, the chicken, that's spurring off an ongoing income through the eggs. But then an emergency happens, a health emergency happens. And what they will often do is sell off the only valuable asset they have that's worth enough is their income generating asset. And so they will sell that off to meet the medical need. And now they've just mortgaged their future, right? So what we want to see is a decrease in the number of people who say, now that I have access to these tools, I no longer have to sell off a household asset. Now I can either borrow money to pay for those needs, or I can use savings or business income. And so we see a huge drop off in the number of people who respond that they are having to sell off assets, and a huge growth in the number of people who say they're able to use savings and income. Same thing for school fees. If they can get their kids in school, those school fees come once a year. So a huge drop off in the number of people who are saying they have to sell off an asset to pay for that. Income steadiness is a big deal. So when you're extreme poverty, you might make $2 today, $5 tomorrow, nothing the day after that, nothing the day after that, $3 the day after that. And that's really hard to manage as a household when you're talking about that little money. That sporadic flow is really difficult. So steadiness of income is a really important factor when you're talking about people living in extreme poverty. And so we see a huge drop off in the number of people who say that their income is either very unsteady or unsteady. So that's an awesome thing to see. Livestock is a huge factor for people living in rural, especially rural extreme poverty contexts, because livestock is both a savings source. It's kind of an investment because the value of livestock will go up over time, and it's a food source in case you need it. It's ongoing income oftentimes. So we see huge improvements in the number of livestock owned by our group members. So, so again, all that to say, is it working? I think just the theory is that we could be providing those things directly, but if you give them access to the right tools, will they generate improvement in those areas on their own? And the answer is that we're seeing the data say that yes, they will. And so that's super encouraging and really great to see. Makalata, I told you the beginning of her story when we started, so I just want to close that out. She said, now that I am in the Seed Effect Savings Group, I can save and get loans. I use my loans to pay school fees and for my business, and it has grown steadier. This group has improved my life as it has helped with the provision of food for my family and made it possible for me to pay for the transport I needed to look for my daughter who had been lost. Now we are reunited. I will continue saving in this group, and I'm going to encourage other members to continue as well. I don't think I have time to play that one. You can find this video on our website. Her name's Mary, if you're interested. But I'll skip that. So I realize I haven't talked a lot about supply chain. So this is a supply chain class. So I did want to at least pose the question, and I hope you guys would be way better at brainstorming about this, but there are absolutely supply chain issues across this whole thing when you're talking about refugees, extreme poverty. I mean, I see it. Our members are trying to start these businesses, but we can train them how to make soap. That's actually a pretty common business. And one thing we saw was that we trained people in soap making but it was a supply chain issue. They couldn't get access to the soap making material. We trained all these people how to make soap to generate an income, and then they couldn't get the soap making materials from the capital of Uganda up into the refugee settlements, and so they couldn't do it. And so we had to go through some pretty challenging things and really kind of show the suppliers the demand that, hey, we've trained these people. If you will show up, they will buy it from you. They didn't expect that they would have money to spend on that, but we've kind of mobilized resources. We've developed a system here where we've created some demand and the ability. So we think if you show up, they'll buy it. They tried it once and it worked. And so now there's a little bit of a supply chain supplying soap making materials to the refugee settlements. But that's one very small example. Those challenges are across the board in food, in clothes, in banking. We're trying to solve the banking supply chain a little bit by kind of creating a little kind of at-home solution. But there's certainly supply chain challenges across the board. And one thing that's actually really interesting when I look through our data, we're working in 4 different refugee settlements. And some of them are closer to a major urban center than others. And we see more improvement in those poverty metrics in the settlements that are closer to the urban center. It's a very viable hypothesis and probably true that it's just the cost of transport. Most of the time they're having to go into the town to get supplies or whatever. The cost of doing that is prohibitive for the people who are further away from the urban center. And so I think that's a supply chain issue. They have the capability, they could be performing as well as the groups in this refugee settlement. It's a distance to market issue. It's a distance to the supply issue. So anyway, I think it's worth considering. You guys would be way better at brainstorming all of that and thinking through that. I guess the only thing I would say is I think a natural question, as it was for us and anyone who gets involved in this space, is the question of, is it worth it? Is it worth trying to figure stuff like that out? Is it worth the investment? Will they even, okay, if we spend all this time trying to figure that out, will they even utilize it? Will they be productive with whatever it is we put in place? And I would say, based on our experience and what we've seen, is that if those solutions are empowering, if they're sustainable, if they're communal, if they're communally based, if they're dignifying, and if they're restorative and they're capturing kind of the whole person and considering what the people are going through, have been through, I believe wholeheartedly, yes, we're seeing it in the data, we're seeing it in our operations, that absolutely, yes, it is worth it. So I think it's worth thinking through challenges like these. And so I hope you guys will and come up with awesome solutions that'll change the world someday. So I'll stop there. But it's been awesome to share just a little bit with you guys. I put my email address there. We have time for questions now, but also if things come up along the way, you are more than welcome to email me. And yeah, I just thank you so much for hanging out with me for a little bit today. Thank you guys.
So let's open it up for questions. Either raise your hand or just off mute or go in the chat and let's ask some questions. Maybe I'll start at Joel. We know that and I've been doing a lot of talking on it, is the global supply chain right now is pretty much broken through globally. So how has that impacted your business?
Yeah. So it's impacted, so far it's impacting us as an organization more than it's necessarily impacting our members, just because what they're dealing with is so local. Their individual businesses are so small, they're not necessarily relying a whole lot on a global supply chain. It's more a local supply chain. But us, so for example, we're trying to launch into a new refugee settlement actually as we speak. So into a 5th refugee settlement. In order to open a new settlement, there's lots of travel involved in it. We need motorcycles, we need a vehicle, We need metal to make these boxes. We do as an organization rely. And so we've absolutely seen delays in getting those things, and more importantly, cost, especially as a nonprofit. The cost of motorcycles has doubled. And so when those costs go up, that the impact on our members is just, that means we'll have fewer members, right? That's thousands of dollars we weren't expecting to have to spend on motorcycles or whatever that we otherwise could have hired trainers with to go start more of these groups. And so I would say the effect is delays in getting new operations launched, and then more money going toward kind of the infrastructure of the operation itself, which then descends into ultimately fewer members served, unfortunately. Yeah.
Questions?
I'm not super familiar with the situation, but you said that communities are adjacent to war-torn countries. Is establishing security, either short-term or long-term, an issue that you have to confront?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so these refugee settlements we're in, they're just across the border from South Sudan. And so there have been occasions where kind of little military factions have crossed the border into Uganda. Most often they're doing that because there's someone specific they're looking for. But the war that's going on in South Sudan is a power, it's a power struggle. They have a really great, parable is not the right word. Anyway, they say that when the elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. So it's these kind of these kind of tribal leaders at the top that are fighting over territory and power, and it's all the people that end up having to flee and are suffering as a result of it. Once they're in Uganda, though, they're kind of out of the territory, so they're not directly in line of the conflict anymore. But like I say, there have been several occasions where there's a specific person they'll come looking for, and I won't get into the details, but the way you get people to talk, they'll do some pretty terrible things to find the people that they're looking for. The United Nations is who runs refugee settlements. The United Nations has a refugee arm, so they actually negotiate with countries about if they'll take refugees, if they'll devote land to refugees. And so the UN provides security forces for these refugee settlements. So we don't have to create security structures or anything. The UN thankfully takes care of that. I will say, on a more minor level, these groups have these metal lock boxes that have money in them. So that's a target for more like local, not, big kind of war security problem, but a local problem if someone knows you have that. And so we do a few things to address that. I mentioned padlocks go on. It's 3 different padlocks with 3 different keys. 3 different people in the group keep those keys. A 4th person keeps the box. Whoever has kind of the most secure house structure, and they'll hide it. A lot of times you'll see a group, the way they move the box from location to location, like 10 different people will have these big white canvas like rice bags, and that they'll all come to the meeting. One of them actually has the box in it, not rice. And then they'll all leave with those bags. So if someone's watching, they don't know who it is that brought the box and who's leaving with the box. So there's some kind of more, group specific, like local keeping things safe, things we have to worry about as the organization. But the bigger needs are handled by the UN. Thanks.
Other questions? There's gotta be some others here.
I have a question.
Donovan, go ahead.
So what are some of the differences you've seen in supply chain due to the differing economic levels?
The different economic levels of our members?
Right, yes.
Like how well off they are, what are the different supply chain issues they see depending on kind of their economic status.
Right, yeah. So compared to like how we are in the United States.
Oh, well, yeah. So like I say, in general, they're more just dependent on the local issues. But that became, so for example, food, during COVID, so Uganda locked down pretty severely during COVID. Most of the food in Uganda is grown in the southern part of the country. These refugee settlements are in the northern part of the country. So even though, it was only a local issue, but they weren't getting the food trucks from the south into the north because there were so many checkpoints along the way. They actually were allowing food trucks to move, but there were so many checkpoints along the way, and it was becoming so time-wise, and people were afraid of leaving kind of their home base and traveling across the country. And so even the truck drivers didn't necessarily want to go. So there was this like food delivery problem from the southern part of the country to the northern part of the country. So even if you could afford food, or even the UN who's trying to do these monthly food rations, the UN cut their food rations in half during COVID. So it's a time where people are already suffering more because of different local factors related to COVID. But now the UN cuts their food rations in half because they can't get the food through the country due to the lockdowns. One interesting one I just saw was again COVID related, but they were doing these samples in the refugee settlements, but it was taking too much time to get them to the testing centers. They were going bad or something like that. They weren't. And so someone came in with drones and they started flying these samples on drones to the urban center so that they would get there in time. So I would say, the difference in supply chain in general, a lot of times it's just kind of infrastructure development. Like it's a lot of dirt roads. It takes way longer to get somewhere there than it does here. So that the expense and time of moving goods from place to place is super expensive if you can even get it there. So even just like the road infrastructure is really difficult. And even things like, just when it's when it's not a developed economy, even things like I say, like formal banking and credit scores and kind of your identity as a recognized person in the country, like all these things matter. Like, who are you? Even if I could call a supplier in the capital to bring me, I'm calling them, but who am I? I don't have like a credit score to refer them to. I don't have, if I'm a refugee, I don't even have a Ugandan ID to refer them to. Like, why should you listen to me that, yes, I'm going to pay you when you show up? Like, so kind of fairly simple things that just exist in an extreme poverty context. Yeah.
So I've got one here. How do these refugees find creative ways to work around the supply chain issues that exist?
So they will, it's a really good question. And I don't even know that I have a good answer. I know that a lot of times they are just having to do it themselves, right? So they will have to pay for transport. So instead of a supply chain like feeding supplies or needed products into the refugee settlements, they're having to go the length, right? So I'm gonna pay for transport to get myself to the capital to get these supplies that I need and pay for myself. And so they're just kind of solving the logistical problem themselves by, I'll just, if I need something, if the product I need is in California, I guess I have to drive to California and go get it and then drive it back. I mean, that's essentially what they're doing because there's not a supply chain necessarily to connect them to it. But it's, so their solution is often this communal aspect, right? Like if they're in one of these groups, they don't just have to figure out on their own. They might have a group idea. The soap making idea, as an example, they'll pull their resources to have a big enough order of supplies that it does become worth it for someone to make the trip for them, right? Like that becomes more economic than them doing it themselves. So it's really difficult when you're in poverty to have enough money, a large enough order to make it worth it to whoever it is that's trying to, you have to be worth it as a customer. So the groups kind of joining together doesn't solve it, but helps generate enough demand that maybe it does become worth it. So I think it's, their creative solutions, I think are kind of banding up together. And then a lot of times like I say, a lot of times it's just like kind of solving it themselves, figuring it out on their own.
Good. We got time for maybe one more question. No? Hey, Joe, I really want to thank you. I think this hits home to a lot of people. We here in the United States sometimes don't realize how it is in other countries. I have the pleasure of being on a committee that helps the poverty, and it's always good to see people really working hard to try to solve poverty. I really want to thank you for taking the time to being with us. Thank
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Appreciate it. Thank you. And for setting it up, and thank you all for your interest. Yeah. For wanting to hear about it. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Ciao.
All right. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.